Today we will be discussing Dr. Joseph Graves Jr., who is a prominent evolutionary biologist and geneticist. Over the course of this semester, we've read several papers by Dr. Graves, and he discusses how species evolve resistances to different environments and how longevity can be altered within a species. In one of his papers, Dr. Graves showed how E. coli can evolve resistance to nanoparticles used in antibiotics, despite having no previous resistances to these nanoparticles. In another one of his papers, he showed how simply altering the reproductive ages and food of Drosophila flies can massively affect their longevity. Both of these experiments showcase Dr. Graves' prowess and understanding of not just evolution, but also how environment can affect the success of a species. Today, we're going to be discussing how Dr. Graves has used his knowledge of the process of evolution and his understanding of genetic analysis to disprove the concept of biological race. Dr. Graves is particularly passionate about this subject, as in our first introduction to him, we learned that he has experienced racial discrimination throughout his scientific career based off of this concept of biological race, which, as he proves, has no scientific basis or utility.
Okay, and starting off with the first paper assigned for these, or the first of these readings, starting off with racial discrimination and equity. He starts off by discussing the origin of species and race, and he starts the paper by mentioning that the distinction between races and species, and he explains that though biological species do exist, human races are socially constructed. And in this section, he emphasizes how the biological concepts are misused to justify social hierarchies and discrimination. In the next section, he discusses how the definition of race and is misused. Dr. Graves discussed how genetic variation with human populations and highlights how the genetic differences do not correlate with the traditional racial categories. And the use of race in biology is misapplied to humans, where race is not defined by biology, but rather social and cultural factors play the largest role in defining racial groups. In the next section, Dr. Graves then uses historical references like the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism that created and reinforced these racial hierarchies as a point to mention how socially defined races were used in justification of exploitation and oppression of other races. Next, he then argues how biological races do not exist, and this is the first of all these three papers where he's starting to discuss how this concept of biological race cannot be applied to humans, but socially defined races are. And the confusion between these two definitions is what has been used to maintain social hierarchies and the systemic racism throughout history. And to conclude that paper, Dr. Graves advocates for a better complex understanding that will disentangle the biological and social concepts of race and emphasize the importance of addressing systemic racism in order to shape this more equitable and just society that we hope to see. That's kind of wrapped up that paper.
I would like to talk about Dr. Graves's views on the concept of race and racism and relate to some of his ideas and answers that were mentioned in the frequently asked questions document. So first, when he was asked about race, he simply defined it as a social classification based on appearance and assumed ancestry. He stressed the idea that race is not biological and does not exist in humans, but it's a worldview that has been used historically to justify social hierarchies, discrimination, and it was a cover for racism and inequality. He also argued that race is a social construct and has real consequences due to its complications. Second, it's also important to mention his discussion about the historical context and misconceptions surrounding race. He traces the origins back to Carl Linnaeus and other early scientists who contributed to racial classification and categorizing humans into different races based on unique traits. He also highlighted that these classifications supported prejudices and practices like slavery and colonization, and the notion of biological race became reinforced through repeated use by authorities despite lacking scientific validity. Furthermore, he emphasized that human genetic variation is continuous and complex and cannot be divided into racial groups. He pointed that social race is highly fluid, varying across cultures and time periods, and does not align with any biological or genetic reality. Lastly, he called for a clear distinction between social race and genetic diversity to dismantle or break up the harmful ideologies that racism relies on.
Yeah, so basically speaking on that, and since a similarity in all of the papers that we've read in class this semester speak on race, there's a third paper that Graves wrote, and it is mentioned, it is called Evolutionary versus Racial Medicine and Why It Matters. And in this paper, Graves talks about how medicine is dependent on biological principles. And he goes on to mention the evolutionary mosaic theory, which we actually learned about in class, and how it states that resistance and evolution plays a part depending on what kind of environment an organism is in. And also, it is a reasoning for why humans get sick. So, however, racial medicine, on the other hand, is believed that there are different biological races among humans. And so, to prove this, there was a lot of different studies that were done. One where Neil Reisch looked at the genetics and self-identified race and used some microsatellites in order to prove this. However, these studies were criticized by not considering things such as mixed ancestry and where people live, which can affect the results of such things. So another study was done using SNPs across small groups of individuals in different races, and they measured the statistical significance for genetic differences using FST. However, only 6% exceeded the threshold, meaning that there was more similarity in there was more genetic similarity rather than differences, which is something that kind of disproves this theory. And also, Graves ends up mentioning and chiming into the notion of Lewontin's fallacy, which basically mentions the idea of population subdivision and says that you can't really use this to disprove the existence of different races in modern humans. But, however, Graves says that using these genetic markers could still group individuals into clusters, but that is only because usually data is collected from distant populations, and therefore that is why we see a clear distance between them. So in all, for this part of the paper, Graves is basically fighting the motion and disproving the theories that race has anything to do with health disparities.
To finish up this third reading about evolution or evolutionary versus racial ideas, Graves points out that a lot of the push towards this racialized thinking towards medicine comes from the differences in health outcomes of African Americans, such as disparities in their lifespans, in their whether or not they contract diseases, and their high mortality rates when compared to Europeans in their same society. And Graves ultimately points out that racial medicine is something of a red herring. There have been many studies that have shown that between 70 and 90% of variation in longevity and in health is due to non-genetic factors. So relying solely on some sort of concept of biological race in order to explain these disparities in health outcomes is ignoring all of the social, political influences that are able to influence health. Another thing that Graves points out is that a lot of this health disparity can just be seen through social and environmental factors, such as African Americans frequently being pushed to live in areas that have high pollutants, poor air quality, and worse access to things like healthcare and schooling. And Graves ultimately concludes that while he hopes the research into this topic will stop focusing on genetic causes, he is not necessarily optimistic. So in conclusion of all of the papers, Graves ultimately disproves that biological race is a major factor, or is in existence at all, and that is not to be confused with socially categorized races, which are a social construct that still exists to this day and still need to be talked about and discussed properly. And that's all we have. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.